Okay, so in this video, we're going to go over the fly cast. And so the fly cast isn't too complicated, but it can be a little tricky to get at first. Most people's first instinct is to cast like they're throwing something. So with the big like arm motions, this isn't really quite the right motion for the fly cast. It's much more of a flick than a throwing motion. So there's a lot of analogies people have drawn to describe the fly cast. One of my favorites is imagine that you're taking a paintbrush and you dip it in some paint and you're trying to flick some paint on a piece of paper you taped on the wall. But you don't want to get paint on the wall and the ceiling, you just want on that piece of paper. So it's just that little flick motion and not a big like arm motion, otherwise you're gonna get paint everywhere. Another analogy I like is it's like hammering a nail. So imagine you had like a nail right about eye level and you're hammering that nail. That hammer has to travel in a pretty straight line and have an abrupt stop right on that nail head. If you do too big of a swinging motion like you're throwing, if you hit the nail, you're gonna bend it, and you might even not hit the nail at all, you're probably gonna hit below it. So you really need that hammer to travel in that straight path with an abrupt stop right on that nail head. So to start the cast, let's talk about how you hold the fly rod. And you're gonna hold it much like you would a hammer, or if you were like going to shake someone's hand. Your thumb's gonna be on top, and your fingers are gonna wrap around the bottom. And you want your hand to be towards the top of the grip, with your thumb right about at the top. And this is gonna give you the most control over your rod. Okay, next let's look a little bit at the stance you want when you're casting. When you're casting, you want your opposite foot just a little bit forwards, like if you were throwing a dart or something. And this is going to be a very stable stance if you're wading in some water, or if you're on a boat. It can be nice and stable. And the other thing this does is it allows you to turn and look at your back cast. And this can be really important when you're first learning the fly cast, because watching that back cast will tell you a lot about your casting and whether you're getting a good cast, and allow you to see some mistakes you might be making. And so the fly cast is really made up of two casts: a back cast or an up cast, and a forward cast or a down cast. And when we make each one of these casts, we're trying to get the rod to do three things. The first thing is we're trying to get that rod to bend or to load. And when that rod bends, it's going to store that energy and then transfer that, and then as it unbends, it's going to transfer that energy into the line. And so the next thing we're trying to get the rod to do is come to an abrupt stop. And that abrupt stop is what allows the rod to transfer its energy from the rod to the line. And so when we're casting, these two things are going to happen twice. Once in the back cast and once in the fore cast. And so the third thing we're trying to get the rod to do is travel in a straight line. We want that rod tip that I'm pointing at you to travel in a perfectly straight line above us. And so that straight line is really important for the quality of your cast. So your fly line is going to travel in the same exact path as that rod tip. And you want your fly line to travel in a straight line, because that's going to create a tight loop, which is going to be the most aerodynamic and energy efficient to get that fly out there. And so if your rod is traveling in a big arc, your fly line is going to travel in a big arc, and your fly cast is going to have a big fat loop, and that's just not a good cast. So we want to travel in a nice straight line above us. And so we want to travel in that straight line on the vertical axis, but we also want to travel in a straight line on the horizontal axis. If we're traveling in a circle, kind of wrapping around our body, it's going to cause that fly line to curve around us too, and we're going to have a really hard time having an accurate cast. So now that we know what we were trying to get the rod to do, let's look at how we start the cast. And to start the cast, we want to start with our rod tip close to the water. If we start with the rod up here, we're only going to get half the distance to move that rod, and we're only going to really be making half a cast. So if we start down low, we're able to use that full area to get a full cast. And so to use a clock metaphor, we're going to start with that rod tip down kind of at 7. And then from 7 to 10, we're just going to start to get that line moving on the water. And then from 10 to 1 is going to be our power stroke, where we really get that cast going. We're going to start at 7, get that line moving up to 10, and then accelerate to a stop to 1, and then accelerate to a stop at 10, and then bring the rod back down. So this clock metaphor is used a lot, and it's normally taught as 10 to 2. But what that does is it causes that rod tip to travel in a parallel line to the ground, a straight line, but a parallel one to the water. And so you're ending up casting your fly above the water, and then it's falling down to the water, which really isn't exactly what you want. And so it was taught to me as 10 to 1, and I like this a lot better, because then you have an upcast, casting up, and a downcast, casting towards the water, where you're really trying to get your fly to go. So when we talk about fly casting, I think it's important to talk about our wrist, and more specifically, breaking our wrist. And some people say that fly casting is no wrist and it's all arm, and some people say it's all wrist and no arm. And personally, I think to get that abrupt stop you're trying to get in a little flick, it's really hard to do that with a completely solid wrist without breaking it at all. And so I think there is some wrist in fly casting, but I think it's important to understand what they're trying to avoid when they say don't break your wrist. And what they're really trying to avoid is from you bringing that rod too far behind you. So because if you bring your rod back and break your wrist, that rod tip drops behind you a lot more. And so if you remember from when we were talking about that rod needing to travel in a straight line, if that rod is dropping behind you, it's going to cause that rod to travel in an arc. And so that's going to create a big fat loop, which is not what you want. And so I think it's okay to use some wrist in fly casting, but if you're looking at your back cast or your forecast and you're noticing that you have a big loop, the first thing I might look at is whether you're breaking that wrist a little too much. And maybe you need to keep that wrist a little bit more straight. So the last thing we need to talk about with fly casting is maybe one of the most important, and that's the timing. So there's a pause between the back cast and the forecast. And that pause is really important because it allows that line to unfurl behind you. And so if you wait too long, which is really uncommon and not many people actually do this when they're learning, but that energy is going to travel out the end of the line and dissipate, and that rod's not going to be loaded properly to then come to your forecast. And you're going to have kind of a weak forecast. And if you go too quick, that line isn't going to unfurl all the way. You're not going to load your rod properly, and you'll probably hear that like whip cracking sound behind you. And that can end up breaking your flies off. So it can end up being an expensive mistake to make too many times. So this is where being able to turn and look at your back cast is super important. When you make your back cast and you're able to turn and look, you can watch that line unfurl behind you. And as it's almost about to be completely unfurled, that's when you want to start your forecast. And over time, you'll be able to feel that rod load as that line travels out. But you'll really get that timing down. I think it's also important to note that the shorter the amount of length you have out the tip of your rod, the faster that timing is going to be. And the more line you have out, the longer you're going to have to wait on that back cast. So that's just the real basics of the fly cast. It's a little tricky at first, can take some practice, but with some practice, hopefully it'll start to feel pretty natural.